Our keynote speaker today is Tony Schum, a Vice President in Duff Phelps Site Selection and Incentives Advisory Practice in Austin, Texas. Tony specializes in identifying, negotiating, and implementing economic development incentives for companies that are expanding or relocating. He also assists clients in the pursuit of workforce training awards, R&D funding, and other grants expected to generate significant economic impact. Prior to joining Duff Phelps in 2011, Tony was a Director of Economic Development for the Austin Chamber of Commerce, where his primary role was recruiting new technology companies to Central Texas. Other areas of responsibility for Tony included business retention and expansion, marketing, and public policy work. And prior to that, to joining the Austin Chamber in 2004, Tony worked for Texas Governor Perry's Office of Constituent Services. Since 2004, Tony has worked with hundreds of companies to secure federal, state, and local incentive awards, from high-tech startups to the Fortune 500. Tony's expertise spans the automotive, biotech, creative media, distribution and logistics, energy, manufacturing, and software industries. Some of Tony's experiences include that he secured more than $150 million in tax and non-tax savings for clients on more than $1 billion in capital investments, managed over 50 company expansions or relocations to Central Texas alone, co-led a collective lobbying effort to create and sustain the Texas Moving Imagine Industry Incentive Program, rebating production expense to film, television, and video game companies. Assisted wireless and energy industry startups with securing Texas Emerging Technology Fund Awards. His other experiences include serving on the board of directors for Clean TX, the primary clean energy and technology industry organizations for Central Texas. Tony also serves on the Young Professionals Committee for Institute for Professionals in Taxation to develop and retain new talent for the tax services industry. And he served on the Austin Film Society's Creative Media Hub Committee and a special advisor to the International Game Developers Association, and served on the Digital Media Council's Strategic Planning Committee. Tony knows economic development. So he is a graduate of Texas State University. He's completed his continuing education courses for Economic Development Institute at the University of Oklahoma. So now I need you to give a warm Victoria welcome to Tony Schum.
Thank you, Jeff. I've had the distinct pleasure of working with Jeff and Dale and Danielle and Sharon and all of the team here in Victoria, which I now kind of consider a family, actually, with the amount of time that we've spent together. But that includes a lot of evaluation for projects and a couple of site tours that are here local to Victoria, where we've actually gone out and seen sites, toured infrastructure, talked to utilities managers, gotten on the ground with local employers. And so the dive that I've taken into Victoria is very deep. And so it's always a pleasure to come back here and see the things that have changed, meet some friends, and make new acquaintances with some of the new elected officials. And congratulations on all your success in the elections. So it's been a really fun process of getting to know Victoria, and there's a lot of promise here and a lot of things to like. So without further ado, I can introduce Duff Phelps sort of as a larger ecosystem. We're headquartered out of New York City, and on any given year, we do about 15,000 engagements for 6,500 clients. So 73% of the Fortune 100 is who we serve, and 50% of the S&P 500 is who we serve. So we have, generally speaking, very large clients with very deep pockets and are well capitalized and are very well respected in their industries. And so when we bring an opportunity and have the pleasure of working with Dale and Sharon and his crew, things usually are moving very fast. And so I'll get to some of those dynamics a little bit later, but we're the world's largest valuation firm. So that's typically how we start, is in the valuation process, trying to understand what the value of something is, whether it be a new facility or intangibles or a brand. That's our bread and butter. So our site selection and incentives practice is concentrated in the Midwest, but I sit in Austin, Texas with a couple of colleagues, and we've got people strategically located all over the United States. And we grew out of the Big Four. So when the Big Four disbanded their site selection practices, we absorbed all of those people and all of the years of experience that we've got and all of the talent that they bring from the government sector, the administrative part of government, and the legislatures. We're extraordinarily heavy in Texas by virtue of sitting in Texas. Corporations know that the gravity of economic development is flowing south. Me being unbiased, me being a person who serves the best interest of my clients, I will take them literally anywhere that proves to be, as a composite, the best possible place for them to have talent and a good tax climate and a good logistical chain and a good chance of success at that new location. And so as we get into the practice of economic development, this is sort of the shotgun approach here on the left. This is the rifle shot approach on the right. When a corporation comes to us and says, we have absolutely no idea where to go, we need your help, that's the open site selection process. Now, if they have a supply chain or some type of site that they purchased years ago and would like to utilize, that's the process on the right. And so those are distinctly separate processes, and the time that it takes to execute those is distinctly separate. The process on the left typically takes years. The process on the right can take as little as weeks or months. One of the things that we like to stress in this is with the multi-jurisdictional approach, there is an immense amount of data and analysis that goes on the left here. On the right, we generally have a pretty specified geography where we know in certain circumstances we're going to have to make real estate decisions. There will be taxing jurisdiction lines, and we need to get in pretty quickly and understand what their prerogatives are in economic development. What are their job creation priorities, and what are their capital investment priorities? On the left, with multi-jurisdictional approaches, we typically start in countries and then work down to national levels, to states, then to MSAs. So we're doing very, very broad level comparisons across MSAs in the United States, and that's essentially creating the labor comparisons and then adding all those additional layers onto the labor basics. So when Dale said trends in economic development, there are about 100 hot trends in economic development. So what I thought would be best is to break it down by geography, industries, and processes, right? And so this is exclusive to what we're seeing within our client base. And certainly there are bigger macro trends. Certainly there are bigger trends with other firms. With our firm, with 3,500 people across the globe, this is exactly what we're seeing. So unprecedented population growth in Texas is bringing lots of new opportunities with residents and companies. That's great, but we're barely keeping up with infrastructure. So planes, ports, roads, electrical grid, all of the things that it takes to keep the lights on and keep the water flowing and keep the roads clear, we are doing an okay job here in Texas. We are stressed, but this is also an absolute must, because everybody that moves here without a job is relying on people like Dale and myself and everybody in the room, in some sense, whether direct or indirect, to help them get that job. And so economic development is really the story of our lives. It's where we work, it's the amount of money that we can afford to go spend on things, and then the people that are making those things, those goods and services, all of their livelihood is affected too. So economic development policies in larger metro areas within Texas are an opportunity for Victoria. As they restrict and as they pull back on some of the incentive opportunities they're willing to consider for whatever reason, as long as we have good, flexible economic development incentive policies in areas that are willing to grow and willing to consider new opportunities, that is a major plus. That is one thing that we always look for. Blanket policies typically result in situations that are untenable for large corporations. So political and economic stability in the state is very good. Scrutiny on major incentive programs, Dale and I were just talking about this the other day. Chapter 313, which is a school value limitation, and Chapter 312, which is a tax abatement, are absolutely critical tools for Texas to level the playing field with a high property tax base. Those are always under scrutiny in the legislature, and rightfully so. We need to take a hard look at those programs, but we also desperately need them as tools. So I think we're going to get the right response from the legislature this time around. On the national level, we've got an unemployment rate that is making it very difficult for people to find jobs. For employers to find people to fill jobs. So that is the complete opposite of what we had during the recession. It is actually a psychological flip for the country. It's a market that's very exciting for people that want new opportunities, but for employers, it's kind of scary. So it's resulting in a lot of wage increases for employers right now. M&A activity is really high, so what you're getting is distressed companies being bought, and that's something that we see a ton on the valuation side. And then you've got healthy companies which are consolidating footprints. So looking at the way in which those facilities exist across the United States for large employers, some of those are being pulled into campus-like activities and developments. Major restructuring of the distribution and logistics network. I'll touch on that a little bit with our big favorite topic next. But then more broadly, U.S. tax reform has created a lot of opportunities too. You've got companies with more money in their pocket now. They can decide to give that back to shareholders in dividends. They can spend it on hiring people. They can give people pay raises, which would be great. They can do a number of things with it that generate economic impact for places like Victoria. Immigration and visa policies, we all know that it's hard to get certain types of highly technical labor sometimes. I think every now and then you'll see Google go and approach the US Congress and ask for more visas. This is a very real problem because every single product in this room, the air conditioners, the cameras, the lights, the carpeting, all of it starts with engineers in a lab somewhere. And new product variations of that all starts with people that fulfill those roles through engineering degrees, and we don't have enough of them in the United States. Tariffs, increasing the cost of raw materials and goods for a lot of our existing companies. And then, of course, at the very highest level, all the way down to the lowest level, elected officials now have the ability to tweet and affect companies' livelihoods and processes by social media. So rising standards of goods in China and Mexico, rising standards of living and wages in Mexico is something that is directly affecting a couple of areas of our practices. So this is creating really two opportunities, I think. Opportunities for Duff Phelps to take a corporation even further away from Mexico and China on those global trade routes, or opportunities for us to look in the United States and reshore. It depends on the value add of the product. And so that's really the differentiator. I think we're going to have a little bit more onshoring opportunities in the next year, which should be very exciting for us. Of course, we all know about other larger sources of instability across the globe. Those are very real. The more you shut down borders, the more you restrict the flow of goods and people, which is generally speaking not good. So a couple of updates for energy and manufacturing. These are areas where we see a lot of opportunity for Victoria, obviously. I think if you made a concerted effort, you could recruit practically any industry to Victoria. You've got a lot of talented folks here and a lot of college and university resources, which is wonderful. But utility scale solar and wind is something we're seeing a lot of, and a lot of it is being piped directly into single users. So think data centers or distribution centers or single users. Electric rate stability is a huge issue for us. So as the market for electricity changes in Texas and more people come on and start buying electricity in Texas, we're very concerned about the ability for Texas to produce peak power. And I think your guest earlier knows that better than anybody. So utilities as ED players are something that we're going to look to more and more. In the manufacturing space specifically, we're seeing a couple of threats and a couple of opportunities. Higher levels of automation can pay dividends in the short term. You'll see factories reinvest. You'll see plant managers request new M&E, which will be more efficient, which is wonderful. But then at the same time, you could potentially have a reduction in headcount. So your community may be faced with a situation where you could say, we need incentives to go out and buy a bunch of machinery and equipment that could save a facility, but it could reduce the headcount there. So that's a hard choice and a hard look that the community needs to be willing to make to save the operation. So that's one thing that we're keeping an eye on. Roads, bridges, broadband, port infrastructure investment, all of this I wrote before even hearing some of the introductions today. So this is extremely coincidental that all of this just happens to be not only a local community concern to Victoria, but a national and international concern for investment in those pieces of infrastructure. Labor shortages in skilled manufacturing trades. It is very difficult right now to hire a highly experienced person to run a shop floor anywhere in Texas, almost regardless of what you're making. It's hard to get people to work on maintenance for machines, much less find people that have a lot of experience in robotics. So those shortages are very real and very pressing issues for a lot of the manufacturing operations here in Texas. I know some of the other places that we visited across the United States are seeing that too. So we need partners like Victoria College, University of Houston, Victoria, to help fill that pipeline as quickly as possible. And then, of course, opportunities in food manufacturing and processing abound in Texas. We produce a lot of what we eat here, so those opportunities are always going to be there. As far as the petrochem industry is concerned, we're excited about what we're seeing there. So there are really two trends, I think, that are big. There's a threat from social media toward the plastics and petrochem industry. It is not a secret that the number of programs, campaigns, initiatives, nonprofits, and general economic development influencers that we've seen in the social media space coming after the plastics industry is a threat. It is a global perception of the plastics industry that needs to be addressed. And so the plastics that we consume every day are pervasive throughout our economy, and that's something that we need to recognize, and we need to partner with the plastics industry to understand exactly what we can do to help them move to more sustainable alternatives. That's coming on the horizon. We hear that all the time. More immediately, we've got a lot of foreign direct investment opportunity from faraway places coming into the petrochem industry. So that will be an exciting opportunity to drive a lot of investment to the coasts. And then, of course, labor shortages are going to hit that industry as well. No secret there. So processes. The process of economic development is definitely changing. My job may not even exist 20 years from now, and I'm fully cognizant of that. So data is driving almost all decisions way before I even get to a community. We know what the real estate will cost. We have a general idea of what type of labor will be there. And so we just need to get on the ground to understand exactly what that component will be. So artificial intelligence is telling us a lot of this. We can use software tools within Duff Phelps to go out and scrape the web and find taxing rates for every jurisdiction in an entire state to tell us what one of the most advantageous places to be from a taxing perspective would be. And then we start to work with that data and layer on our own personal expertise. So we're launching a new platform, as are some of our competitors, before the end of this year to try and help us manage that data influx. Partners. As much data as we could ever imagine using, this is still a people-driven business. And I will continue to work with Dale. I've had the benefit of Dale coming to Austin for us to have coffee and just talk about what's going on in our world, what we're doing to serve those 6,500 clients and 15,000 engagements per year, and find out what Victoria can do to make itself more competitive in that space. So I belong to IPT, work with the governor's office, on the same side of the coin as Dale and his team. We participate in TEDC. We go talk to the Texas Legislature and tell them what tools we need and what we can do to make communities in Texas more successful and more competitive. We're encouraging your community to come to us as a site selection firm and tell us what your community has so that we don't miss anything and we can perfectly align opportunities that we've got in our pipeline with what you may have. And then, of course, local CEO councils. Every time Dale goes and talks to a local CEO, he is potentially opening the door to a peer or some other person that can give him an idea of what their logistics chain looks like, or some other partner or supplier that could potentially come to Victoria and benefit from all of the things that the other companies that have built successful businesses here have done. I don't think you could talk about the process of economic development without talking about Amazon as well. Amazon is a paradigm-shifting project. And HQ2 is, if you don't know, 50,000 jobs originally. And 50,000 jobs split into 25,000 jobs in 2 metros. And then that split into 10 different metros with thousands of jobs apiece. And so the process that they went through is the complete opposite of what we would have done as a firm. We respect the offer of confidentiality from communities. We have a ton of analysis that goes in up front to try and pare down the amount of communities and not make it a spectacular competition that is engaged entirely in the public sphere. So there are a couple of things that Amazon has done that has flipped site selection and incentives negotiation on its head, which is really interesting. I don't know that you can judge that in its own time. I think 5 or 10 years from now, we'll have a much better idea of how that's gone over. But that's really interesting because, like I said, that's typically not something that we would do. I think that is a perfect segue to how we would see Victoria for the next project. And like I said, we've got one under consideration, and I've worked with Dale on a prior project. So now that we know the community and we know exactly what we can do here, it's important, I think, to understand where we would go in the grading process. And so overall, very good. There is a lot to like about Victoria, especially when considering other metros in Texas. So this is from a recent site visit. And these are our rankings that have been sort of sanitized, if you will, and more genericized to try and protect all of the information that we need to. But we score on the population, public health, education, and labor components, transportation costs, business climate and community, real estate and taxes. These are all of the things that we evaluate when going into a project. And it's absolutely critical that we get the weighting right. So as you can see up here, labor comprises approximately 25% of that score on the basis of 100. So you can tell exactly how important that labor component is. And that's how we start whittling down cities and eliminating cities. And so I think you should feel very proud as a community that Victoria made several cuts to get to this level and to be considered at this level for this project. So what we would consider to be fair, is one of the ways in which we would characterize the population growth. You see a lot of fair and good up there. Those are above average terms for what we would use to compare you to all of the other metro areas that we considered for that particular project. So it's not a definite or a finite definition across the board, but for that particular project, it was a great score, and it was something that initiated a site visit. So something to be proud of. With every opportunity, such as business and community climates, we need to keep those high. That's a really good metric to have, is a level of excellence there. But then when it comes to sites, we came here, we saw a beautiful site, absolutely perfectly clear, had a training center right next door, infrastructure in place, but it was one. And so there wasn't a ton of opportunity to drive around and see additional sites in the community. So if that particular site didn't work, we didn't have a tremendous amount of alternative within the community to go and see. And that means site ready, right? So gas, power, water, sewer, telecom, proximity to other employers, roads are ready. All of those things were critical, and other metros that you were being compared to at the time had more. So that's one of the reasons in which you'll see this comparison start to describe those in less than glorious terms. But the site itself that we saw was very good. So the distinction between the site selection and incentives process as it pertains to Texas or Victoria, we hear a lot about quality of life, and we always say in the practice and in the communities, quality of life is like your own child. You think it's the most beautiful child in the world. And so every community has a wonderful quality of life, unless we all know otherwise. But what are the other key differentiators you can bring besides being a wonderful Texas community that's friendly and welcoming? Well, tax climate, the availability of real estate, the availability of labor, the quality of labor, making sure that all these things are addressed in your community is exactly what Dale and your responsibilities collectively are to make sure that you win the project. Victoria, luckily, is shielded from a lot of the cost increases that other major markets in Texas have had. And it's been really bad. You've had communities that are forced into the suburbs and exurbs. You've had flight to more cost-effective international destinations. So Texas is experiencing unprecedented growth, but it's also losing some companies and some population on the back end, which is concerning, because those are typically at-risk people or at-risk companies. So relationships with EDOs, especially workforce development, is absolutely critical. Utilities estimates, this is something that this represents an ongoing cost, right? The cost of acquiring real estate is a one-time transaction. Nobody's going to sweat $1 million here or $1 million there. But when you examine the opportunity to buy electricity on a deregulated market for 50 years, that's going to become a very big cost, just as big as labor in some certain capital-intensive industries. So another thing to note here for future site selection considerations in Victoria, the proximity to the coast was something that we thought was actually scoring fairly well. We did a risk hazard assessment just on Victoria alone, and actually the score came back pretty good. But the perception of the community being this close to the coast was that it was susceptible to flooding, hurricanes, even though the data didn't bear that out. The risk hazard index was actually pretty good. So you're fighting a perception versus reality battle there. That being said, most corporations are concerned about climate change. That's a very, very real concern for most of them. They don't want to invest $50, $100, $500 million in a facility and have it be under climate change threat 10 years later. And that's a smart perspective. So these tools on the right are the tools that we use every day in, day out, to try and equalize the playing field. So if you have a site in another state or a site somewhere else in Texas with a higher taxing jurisdiction rate, these are tools that we use to try and even things out. So Chapter 380, 381 is a very flexible document. You can give land or tax rebate or a variety of things under Chapter 380 or 381. The more traditional of those is Chapter 312, which is a tax abatement. That's what has been Texas's bread and butter for decades. And the Chapter 313 is a limitation on their school value. So if they build $500 million worth of property, they could conceivably be held at $20 to $100 million worth of value. So any difference in between is the companies to keep with some supplemental payments to the school district. So that's extremely important in a high property tax state like Texas when we look at other states that have much lower millages. New markets tax credits and opportunity zones, those are federal programs. Dale, I know, is all over those opportunities. Those are for investors to shield themselves from capital gains taxes. Again, very important, especially for smaller projects. Those could potentially be bread and butter for a community like Victoria. Those represent a lot of opportunity because those are being talked about all over the place right now. Enterprise zones target at-risk people that put them to work through this program. It's essentially a rebate of state sales tax, and to the extent that they generate a lot of liability there, they can get rebated on that, and it puts a lot of people to work that otherwise wouldn't have had those opportunities. Tax increment financing, great way to dedicate new taxes from a project into the infrastructure side of the project. Fee waivers, and then, of course, doing the analysis to make sure that the city or the county or whatever the taxing jurisdiction is comes out net positive. We're doing economic impact analyses on our end, so y'all might as well do them on the community side to make sure that we're both looking at the same pot of money at the end of the day. When it comes to community development and economic development, obviously very different priorities between the two. Community development, everybody in this room helps with that. Everybody in the room has a role to play in community development. If you own a business, make sure it succeeds. Make sure you give people hiring opportunities. Make sure you pay a fair wage. It's help your neighbor, help people start businesses. Victoria is a wonderful place for that because it is relatively small compared to some of the other bigger metros. So that is a huge advantage. You know your neighbors in here, and you can be welcoming and open and friendly and help everybody grow to their biggest potential and to their greatest extent. So direct air service would help this community get to another level, a level to attract bigger, more connected projects globally. Obviously focusing on the STEM, the arts and the sciences and the engineerings and the maths curriculum within your colleges and K through 12 curriculum is critically important. Every single person in this room knows someone who works at a place where STEM essentially makes the place run. They manufacture things or they provide services that are highly reliant on engineering and math. So one of the things that I've seen work really well is the community pitching in and creating programs that divert high schoolers' attention and the attention of their parents to FAFSA applications. There's a lot of money out there federally for kids to go to college if they know that they can go. Assuming their grades are good and that they're qualified to get into school, a lot of them just don't know that they can go. And that's a crazy disconnect because it's a matter of filling out a form and paying the small fee. Community development block grants, I assume your city and your county is working to identify federal opportunities and grab those for street improvements, for workforce initiatives. Those are oftentimes much easier than raising local tax revenue to accomplish the same thing. Small business development loans, those are great opportunities for people in town. I assume that the city is on top of small business development loans. There's certainly lots of good precedent out there, if not, so lots of good models to follow in Texas. For economic development, this is really where we work with Dale hand in hand every day. The site selection preparation, make sure that we're all prepared for a site visit and had everything that we could possibly need to know at our disposal when we come here with the client. Responding to Texas Governor's Office RFPs, requests for proposal, that's critical. Making sure that the inflow of inquiries that are free into the state are responded to. He has a ton of great people working on his staff to fill out those RFPs and get them back. Making sure that we understand exactly how cooperative and amenable the city councils and the commissioners' courts are within your community to incentives and welcoming new businesses. That's critical before we even get to the negotiating table to figure out what it would take to get the project there. That goes for local school boards too, and making sure that they're familiar with Chapter 313. Your local partners like Victoria College and the University of Houston are absolutely incredible resources for companies coming in and trying to figure out how they would hire 500 new people. They've never been to your community before. They have a reasonably high level of confidence that they could do it, but then when they get here and they see partners that are ready to go, and they say, we've done it for other companies and we're perfectly willing to do it for you for free, that goes a long way. And people really pay attention to that. So those corporate research programs and those corporate partners represent places that are potential investors in the community. And then, of course, BR&E is the bread and butter of any community. It's the blocking and tackling. It's business retention and expansion. I'll get to the 80-20 rule after this, but that is really where a lot of a lot of communities don't focus a lot of attention when they should. Recruitment is sexy. Recruitment is exciting. Having new businesses come into a community is incredible. And it's one of the noblest pursuits I can think of because it brings fresh life and energy into a community, which is amazing. But BRE is one of those things that you really can't neglect. It's an incredible source of opportunity and investment. Getting to the one of the things that makes Victoria distinct. This is my second visit to Fasades. This is one of the places I love to come, and this is a cultural treasure. I mean, this place is so cool, and people like me will drive for hours on a weekend to be able to come to a place with a history like this. This is one of those places that connects past and present, and it's a cultural treasure in this community, and it's one of those things that you can't afford to lose. So it demonstrates economic development on the absolute smallest level. It's a restaurant. It doesn't generate that much sales tax, but it's such a unique thing within the community, and it's such a great flavor of people meeting and taking pride in their community and creating something that's special. Anybody can have big restaurants in their community that come in from corporate chains and do that sort of thing for fast food service. That's wonderful, but this is special. This is emblematic of what a community has to offer. So again, sort of to conclude with major issues and considerations, skilled labor shortages are a huge threat, and they're a major concern on the national level. Wage inflation for high demand occupations, that's something to keep an eye on and something to have to try to work around in economic development. Automation and AI will be bringing huge changes. I doubt that you would have a call center built in the United States in the next 5 years, because Amazon and Alexa and some of the other AI developers are making those types of things obsolete. Those are going to be handled by computers and at light speed compared to human beings. An increased foreign direct investment, huge opportunities for places like Victoria, because Texas is on lots of major international radars for investment. And so for primary considerations, the 80-20 rule is of 100% of the new jobs that your community will create over the next 10, 20, 30 years, 80% will be from businesses that are already here. And so they deserve that attention, they deserve that energy and your time. It takes so much more to recruit, to get that fresh blood and that fresh energy into a community, which is super important, and it's vital to grow, but we can't neglect the businesses that are already here. They're absolutely critical. Retention, that's the name of the game for that particular rule. And readiness, readiness to be ready for that site visit, to be ready for answers and putting the right people together in the room when opportunities come along, that goes a long way. Relationships, feel free to call me or anybody in my firm with any questions whatsoever regarding potential investment, landscapes, opportunities. We're always open and we're always willing to listen because it benefits our clients to know what you know. And then aggressiveness and follow-up. I mean, Dale calls me and says, hey, I'm going to be in Austin at the legislature. Do you want to have coffee? It just keeps Victoria top of mind. And he's doing that all the time for us to just make sure that we don't lose opportunities to work together on projects. So that goes a long way too. And then finally, leverage the data. If your community has specific things about it that you consider unique or characteristics that you can't lose, for example, you graduate a lot of engineers, or you have a specific type of concentration of an industry here, leverage that data. Figure out what that means in terms of investment prospects, and go out and tell Dale, and he'll go out and attack those at trade shows and industry opportunities, and he'll go call people, and maybe we'll have the opportunity to work together because they may be in the D&P universe. So I think that's sort of the end of my formal remarks, and I would love to take some questions if anybody has any. Sure.
I appreciate what you had to say about Fasades. I agree. But on that same vein, how important do you see like a revitalized downtown, Fasades downtown, in terms of recruiting?
Sure. It's absolutely critical because it's the face of the community, right? So we've driven through some communities that had super low tax rates and great infrastructure and a great site, but some of the company executives can look around and say, why is there blight in this community? Or why aren't people investing in their facades? Or why do businesses look like they're half full? And whether or not a community is growing is absolutely impactful. Because as communities shrink, whether it's a business or a person leaving, they're taking tax revenue with them. And so if you're not growing, you're dying sort of adage, there's a lot to that. And so it is your first and your last impression usually rolling through a downtown area. So I would consider that to be not nearly as critical as the site itself or some of the business operations viewpoints that we have, but it sure does make an impression.
Tony, blanket policies. You mentioned at the beginning of your presentation about blanket policies and how that's not a good thing to work with.
Sure.
What's an example of a blanket policy?
Well, so the ultimate blanket policy is we don't do incentives, and I've seen a community say that to us, and oftentimes it absolutely dumbfounds me because as a policy, if that's something that you're unwilling to consider, then it generally means you're not interested in actively diversifying your economy. And so, you may think you're generating lots of tax revenue. You may think your neighborhoods are full and healthy and at the perfect level of congestion or economic activity, but it means that you're unwilling to look at specific opportunities that come along. So I can see a well-crafted economic development or incentives policy being restrictive of certain things. It's up to each community to develop what its priorities are, but a blanket policy is generally speaking something that is generally ill-advised. So the question is there would it be something a city council would want to undertake or an initiative to undertake to narrow the industries that you're targeting? Broadening the economic development policy is usually something that benefits a community because every single project should be taken on its merits, right? And it should be taken on a net impact basis. So do you need retail jobs in your community, or do you need primary jobs, or do you need middle skill jobs? And the ability to look at any project that comes along from a guideline or a policy standpoint is wonderful, because then the city council and it's elected to represent the constituencies that are represented throughout the community from top to bottom, can make a decision on behalf of the people that they elect or the people that elected them and represent them.
So bring me a deal and let me look at it.
Let me look at it. Let me evaluate it on a case-by-case basis. I've seen communities, what seems to work really well is if they are targeting certain industries or certain jobs, then they'd be willing to give preferential tax treatment to them to try and induce that investment. And that seems to work really well.
Henry.
Oh, great question. Great question. So how important is it that communities start engaging in essentially what will be their response to the U.S. Census, right, in 2020? Okay, so it's absolutely critical. I mean, I think a lot of us know that the census responses from a community will dictate the amount of federal tax revenue that you are allotted, right? So police, fire, EMS, special projects, disaster recovery, all of the things that federal tax dollars are used for are done on an allocation basis, right? So not only does it affect your representation in Congress and a lot of the political ramifications of the U.S. Census response, but as a community, you're entitled to certain federal dollars that are allocated on the basis of population. And so if your population is improperly represented, either over or under, you're either getting too much or too little, usually too little, and that can impact a city's ability to run and function properly. Yeah, so that's hugely important. That's a great question. And a great question about the policy, again, because policies are usually intended to be restrictive. They're usually not put out there as an intent to say, here's how friendly we are. Policies are usually written in a way in which they're kind of creating bumper lanes for communities. And if you widen that out, then you still have the discretion under Chapter 312 or Chapter 380 to determine your own fate.
Anything else?
Help me understand the threat of climate change, because in my mind, if the climate's changing, it's changing in Victoria, Texas, and Waco, Texas, and everywhere else. Why is it a specific threat to one community?
Absolutely. So climate change, and far be it for me to assume I have a full understanding of climate change's effect on Victoria specifically. I think only a climate scientist could really get into the details and the weeds of how your specific community would be affected. But suffice it to say that it will create erratic weather events. It will create drought in certain places that have never had drought before, fire risk in places that have been relatively fire-free before. It dries places that are wet, it wets places that are dry, and it is a representation of the erratic nature of the climate, which normally changes much slower than when CO2 is introduced as a factor, an influencing factor into the environment. So it's really speeding up a level of change that communities have much longer periods of time to respond to. So, for example, if we elevated a degree over 50 years versus elevating a degree over 10 years, all the buildings that the city has in the private investment, that has been made in homes and businesses, if we need to air condition more or provide more disaster or flood resistance to buildings, they have a much shorter time period to react to how that climate is changing. And so if we need to elevate properties, or if we need to make them more fire resistant, or if we need to increase HVAC requirements in buildings, we have a much shorter time period to be able to affect those changes.
I think you were suggesting that on a company level, a corporation level, that's going to invest hundreds of thousands, hundreds of millions, or billions of dollars in a facility.
Right.
They would take that into consideration because they're looking 30 or 40 years down the road.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, a lot of the clients that we represent don't just build facilities and look out 4 or 5 years. They build facilities and think, where is this going to be in 50 years? Do we even have enough land to expand this facility if we decide to double down and invest in this community multiple times?
Tony, thank you.
Thank y'all so much. I appreciate it.